Hi, everyone. My name is Madison Aboud, and I work with Brione here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's U.S. Africa Business Center. So it's my pleasure to welcome our first group of esteemed panelists to the stage to discuss the importance of SMEs in strengthening economies across Africa. This panel will be moderated by Toni Weis, who works closely with the Chamber's Africa program through his work at the Center for International Private Enterprise. He's also a research associate at GEG and a visiting researcher at Johns Hopkins University. So there is going to be time for a few questions after each panel today, but because of the breadth of the panels, I encourage you all to ask questions during the networking lunch as well. Without further ado, I'll let Toni further introduce himself and the rest of his panel.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, perfect. Good morning, Yali Fellows, and good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here today, and I'm saying that because I've had the good fortune to meet quite a few Yali Fellows over the past few years. At the Center for International Private Enterprise, we've had fellows from Benin. I think there's one fellow here today from Benin. We've had a fellow from Ethiopia work with us. I was here at last year's conference. And most recently, I was in Abidjan, and I met with a group of Yali entrepreneurs to talk about some of the challenges that they face in running their startup companies in Côte d'Ivoire. And really, without exception, I have found that the Yali Fellows are a group of extremely bright and talented and entrepreneurial young people. And so that makes me excited to get to know all of you a little bit better today. The US Chamber likes to say that there's nothing bigger than small business. And so I think it's only fitting that we start today with a panel on SMEs. And we don't have a lot of time, but we're going to try and look at this issue from two sides, really. On the one hand, we're going to look at the role that African SMEs play in the transformation of African economies. But then we also want to bring in the perspective of the growing engagement of US SMEs and foreign SMEs and the challenges that they face and maybe the opportunities that they create. And that really ties in very well with the work that I personally do at CIPE. We have programs in Africa that really focus on two things. We help African SMEs really from Zimbabwe to Ethiopia to Nigeria to Burkina to the Gambia in organizing politically and in defending their interests and in struggling for a better business environment. And our second set of programs looks at setting up anti-corruption compliance programs within African SMEs that not only help them improve their corporate governance, but also make them more attractive as partners for US corporates and US SMEs. And we're going to talk a little bit about that compliance aspect later on as well. But you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from a set of really esteemed panelists today. So let me introduce them really briefly, and I think you have more information in your programs as well. Let me start with Ambassador Robin Renee Sanders, who has literally written the book on the subject. It's called The Rise of Africa's Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, and it came out earlier this year, and we're excited to hear more about that. Ambassador Sanders is the founder and CEO of FEEDS, which is a business and investment advisory firm that looks specifically at Africa. Is that? Yeah? Perfect. And as her title indicates, she's a former US ambassador, I should say, to Nigeria and to Congo-Brazzaville, and permanent secretarial representative to ECOWAS as well. On your right side, we have Ken Flechler, the man who's going to help us power through the next 45 minutes. In his capacity as Chief Administrative Officer for the Pike Corporation, which is, I guess, a step up from an SME, a company, and really a leading engineering company that installs and maintains electric grids, and that has started to work in Tanzania and is now expanding its work in Africa, and really, I think, working in one of the most exciting sectors that there are today in Africa. And then last but certainly not least, Paul Sullivan, who I would say embodies the spirit of the Yali program, because what he does is building bridges, or at least selling bridges. He's the Vice President of International Business Development at Acrow, and to be a little bit geeky, Acrow sells a really interesting product, a a modular steel bridge that you can fit into a shipping container, really drop in the most remote places and install there. And if I understand it correctly, Acrow has done this in 20 countries in Africa?
Yes, we've been active in more than 20 countries across Africa. Yes.
And I believe you're building more than 100 bridges in Cameroon alone at the moment, is that?
Yeah, currently we're supplying 55 bridges to Cameroon and 144 bridges to Zambia.
Wow, that's impressive stuff. But before we get back to this, maybe let's kick off with a question to all of you. We're several years now into the Africa Rising narrative, but there's still, especially in the SME world, quite a few companies that are reluctant to make the transition to Africa. Now, the three of you really don't have to be convinced anymore. So I wonder, what is it that makes you excited about working in Africa? Maybe we'll start with the ambassador.
For me, there are a couple of things, I think. First of all, welcome to the Mandela Yali Fellows. This is my third year interacting with an incredible group of young people. And I end on the word young because you're a young continent, which you all know. You will be the largest working age population in the entire world combined by 2035. So just think about that presence on the continent in your generation. And so what gives me hope and what gives me sort of the background that I have on Africa SMEs, I kind of began on the continent when SMEs, social enterprises, stepped into the voids that were left by lack of development in areas. And I've seen that progression where the transformation is taking place really at the grassroots level, at the SME or MME, a company 10 people or less, at the MME level, really making an impact, coming up with creative ideas and responses to some very simple development problems that have been there forever. And it doesn't take rocket science in some cases. It's a service you provide for a need that is there. It can be as simple as a Uber-like activity. For instance, in Nigeria, they have something now called GoMax, which is the motorcycle version of an Uber. It doesn't have to be that complex. I think that across the board, what gives me hope is that I see Africa SMEs, and I've done training programs on the continent and training programs here just with Africa SMEs. And the thing that gives me hope is that you're involved in the range of sectors. And even if you're doing social enterprise, which is, you can do good, but also doing well for yourself and your family. And so I see more and more that transition from combining your passion with making an income for yourself and your family at the same time. Just let me also leave you with a couple of things, factoids to mull around. Africa will be a $3.4 trillion market. If the continental trade market actually kicks off in 2018, that's been proposed by the African Union. So it gives you a tremendous opportunity to not only trade on the continent, but certainly trade off the continent. I have a number of things that I created something called my top 8 list of sectors. I won't go through them here, but they are mentioned in the book. But just to give you an example, you've come at an age where technology has done 2 things for you. It's given you knowledge management in your hand, and what else has it given you? Mobility. So those 2 things combined set the stage for you to be able to step into anything that you want to do as an SME, as a social enterprise, because you don't have to have a whole network to do that. The internet, the mobility, the knowledge management allows you to do that. I do want to talk to the women, the young women in the audience. You represent 50.1% of the entire population on the continent. And what that means to me is that if we're not helping women more, then you're never going to have true transformation and development. Because if you leave that much of your population out, then you're not going to do that. That trickles down also to how female SMEs struggle more than male SMEs to get financing. I know that all of you have heard the access to financing issue, but let me give you this figure. It's a worldwide figure. It's not an Africa specific. There is a $285 billion financing gap for for women SMEs. That is a huge gap in your ability to get financing. What are the chances that when you go into a bank, the person on the other side of the table will be a male or a female? Likely it'll be a male. So you're not even dealing with counterparts. There are not enough women in the STEM sector, and you can be in the STEM sector, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There are not enough African women in the technology side. I looked and looked for a CEO of a large African tech company. I couldn't find one. You do have COOs and you do have CFOs, but you have no female CEOs to this date. So there's some things that have to be done. There are only 4 countries on the continent that have a ministry of SMEs, only 4, and South Africa just kicked theirs off last year. So you don't even have a place where you can go for good policy. The example, comparing that to the United States, the SMEs contribute on the continent about 20% to their country's GDP on average. Some countries are higher or lower on that scale than others. In order to really make it to the next level, for instance, using the US as an example, we have 28 million SMEs in the United States, and they contribute roughly about 57%, according to our Small Business Administration, to our GDP. So you see the potential for your growth and for your transformation. And the last couple of things I want to mention is the role of China, which I think is an interesting one. I am on the positive side of that ledger. I know that a lot of people are not, but I tend to be on the positive side because I think that whatever partner you work well with, you work with that partner. Where you get your services from, whether you're doing regional trade, what have you, as long as you are on a transparent and fair footing with your partner. And then the last thing is this whole idea of marrying small companies with big companies. The other challenge I saw in doing the research was that you needed to have more what I would call special economic zones, where both large companies and small companies work together in the zone. That's a way that you can build trust, that you know, okay, this SME is registered in my manufacturing zone, in my economic zone. So if I want to partner with them or subcontract with them as a large company, I know that they are qualified then to do that kind of thing. You have about 6 or 7 countries now on the continent, mostly being funded by China, building these special economic zones where they plan to partner large companies with small companies. So I know I probably talked a little bit longer than you wanted to, but I'll stop there, and I have some other tidbits as we go along.
Great.
Pleasure.
Paul, you work for an American, well, medium-sized enterprise, yes. I would say. What gets you excited about doing so much business in Africa?
Well, I think certainly the Honorable Ambassador, that was a wonderful recitation of many of the opportunities and some of the challenges that SMEs in Africa and the United States have working in Africa. I think it'd be difficult to add to that comprehensive discussion other than to share Acrow's experience in Africa. You know, economic diversification is what offers broad employment and improved prosperity and opportunity. I think for Acrow, our contribution to economic diversification is the understanding that a diversified economy requires adequate infrastructure, from ports to roads to bridges, and we happen to be focused specifically on bridge infrastructure. And our particular product, the prefabricated modular steel bridge, is particularly useful in frontier or emerging markets where bridges in rural areas in particular need to be mobilized rapidly, but also need to be quite robust in structure and capacity to manage unsupervised loads, et cetera, and in particular helping facilitate agricultural development, which is a major driver of employment, particularly in Africa, and a major source of opportunity there. So how has Acrow done it? How have we partnered with African governments and African SMEs? What we've tried to do is create a model which is really a solution for what we saw as infrastructure deficits and funding deficit. So what we've developed are finance comprehensive bridge development programs where we essentially work with the government to develop a list of bridges that we can build a project around, whether it's 50, 100, 150 bridges delivered within 12 to 18 months. Then we arrange the financing through major international financial institutions, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, others. And usually those are supported by US Exim Bank, which is an export credit agency here in the United States, or OPIC, which is a US development finance institution. And then the last part, which we think is most important, which gets to this SME discussion, is we also embark upon an extensive local skills transfer program where we train local engineers and technicians in the assembly, installation, and maintenance of these critical infrastructure assets. So we've been successful doing that in Angola in 2009. We supplied 151 bridges in 12 months. In Ghana in 2010 and 11, we supplied another 100 bridges. And as I mentioned earlier, we're currently supplying 55 bridges to Cameroon and 144 bridges to Zambia. Now, how does that impact African SMEs? Well, we are not a company that is going over and installing all of these bridges with 100 Americans parachuted from some plane. We are involved in working with, in any country, dozens of local contractors or engineering firms from substructure design to the installation of the bridges on the construction side. Currently, we're in the design phase in Cameroon, where we're working with dozens of Cameroonian engineers and technicians who have already done all of the studies, and now we're preparing for shipping and installation in the next year. So that's the impact that we see, and we're hoping to replicate this model across the continent so that not only is there infrastructure that facilitates some of these broader economic objectives, but also there's a skills component and an employment component, not just with the SMEs that are specifically engaged in our bridge project, but also in the agribusiness that's associated with some of the rural road development that we've been a big part of over the last 15 to 20 years. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Ken, I believe that Pike first went to Tanzania in 2010, so right after the financial crisis in the US, at a time when the sector in the US wasn't doing so well. How has that venture paid off for you?
So Pike is a for-profit company. We go where the market is. And in 2009, we couldn't find work in the US. So we looked abroad, and that's how we got to Tanzania. And it was through a partner, a local partner, that we were introduced to the market. And as we looked at the market, we brought in a handful of Americans and hired a couple hundred Tanzanians, and built out a couple hundred miles of low and medium voltage transmission and distribution lines throughout the country. It was a great success for us. We felt like we were able to partner. We were able to accomplish our goals. We were done on time, on budget, and we had zero quality defects. So it was a huge success for us and MCC, I think. We're continuing to look at Africa because Africa is really poised to be the first adopter of what previously happened in telecom. In telecom, how many African families had a wired phone to their house? Not many, probably, unless you lived in the larger cities. So that's getting ready to happen in the energy sector with the adoption of distributed generation and the renewables, as well as the battery technology. You'll all of a sudden see that being applicable around the world. And Africa is really poised to be the first adopter of that and to impact their country. So as we continue to look at technology and the market, we're very, very excited about Africa.
I want to get back to a point that really all three of you made, and that's the connections that are possible between US SMEs going into Africa and local small businesses, and the sort of different philosophy that you have in terms of what you said, not parachuting in and then leaving as soon as everything's been built and bring in all your own staff and own people. Do you think there's something specific to being an SME or a medium-sized company that makes you maybe more dependent or more in search of local partners? Or is there a philosophy aspect to that as well? Or
I'd like
where does
to
it come
actually
from?
start. He used a word that, that I think defines it quite well. You are the key. Because you know your environment, you know the lay of the land, you know, you have confidence in your contacts. You are the door that opens. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, in the training that I've done on the ground in Nigeria, and then also starting the first cyber center in Congo, Brazzaville, after the destruction of their civil war along with UNDP, one of the first things that you learn in that connection is your ability to see where services can be provided. And it does, as I said earlier, I call this on my TEL list, my top 8 list, it's number 8. And I call it the aha moment. Because it can be anything, an idea, a spark, that fills a need. And you say, what do you say when that happens? You say, aha, right? You know, exactly. So it can be any of those things. So you are the key. You open that door. I encourage the diasporan Africa SMEs that are here in the United States, and I use diaspora with the big D, because to me it's all inclusive. It includes me as well as you. But you are the key. You open that door. You know the lay of the land. And it provides companies, you know, like Paul's and Ken's, sorry, I knew I was going to say that, and Ken's, the opportunity to do business with you. And I think that the businesses that do well on the continent are the ones that have those local partners and those local connections.
Let me maybe follow up on that. I've met quite a few Yali fellows who ended up starting their own business, or who, you know, were working in business in one way or another. When the two of you, you know, working in infrastructure, when you look for local partners, what is it that you're looking for?
Well, I think I'll start. One, the Honorable Ambassador mentioned sort of ascertaining the local needs. There's no way to make a proposal that's really solving challenges unless you really understand what's happening. And we have found, particularly in the engineering and contracting field, that particularly in rural areas, it's essential that you're working with local engineering firms, local construction firms. Most of those, almost all of them, are SMEs by our definition, economically speaking. And then the last part, of course, is execution. You know, this may come as a surprise to many Americans, but you're actually not that great at executing in a rural village in Africa. So you need African SMEs. So the idea of the parachuting in 100 Americans is not particularly useful. So, you know, ascertaining the needs and execution of the project once a fully developed proposal is there is essential. So that's what I would share on that point.
Great. For us, really the vetting of the local SME is important to us. We have this law called the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which really oversees how we do business abroad. And we take that law very seriously because we go to jail and find millions, if not billions of dollars. So as we're looking for a local partner, we spend a lot of time vetting them and vetting their reputation, and then work with them very slowly to make sure that they follow up what they say they're going to do. And at any time, we have stopped. We went through a process in actually the Bahamas. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars putting together a proposal, and we found out that our local partner had a board member that was a silent board member, but the brother of the prime minister. And so we basically pulled our bid and refused to bid on it. And we had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and lots of time and effort. So having that local partner that we can count on and know that we can count on ongoing is really hard for us to find.
Please, absolutely.
One of the reasons I mentioned the fact that there are only 4 countries with SME ministries, which to me was astounding in a way. A lot of time the SME portfolio is assumed under another ministry. And the point that Ken makes is extremely important, because if you had an SME ministry, A lot of that vetting, policy, regulations, all that can flow through a ministry. If you look at the example of U.S. Small Business Administration, I'm not saying you have to recreate the U.S. SBA, but I am saying that there should be a central policy, financing guarantee, all those kinds of services dedicated to SMEs, particularly because the idea of finding or developing enough formal jobs for the population I just mentioned to you is just not realistic. So it's got to be entrepreneurship, it's got to be SMEs, it's got to be social enterprises. And I think if you had more governments that really created the Ministry of SMEs, that includes policy, that includes training, that includes loan guarantees, all the things that help you move forward. You probably don't know that Google started as an SME. It got its first loan from the U.S. Small Business Administration. Google did. So it's that kind of support. And just the other little fact on just how relevant it is and how long we took to get there in the United States. Because sometimes we sit back and we say, these are some of the things that you should be trying. But we didn't start the US SBA in the United States until 1956. And I say that's still a long time ago, but we were an industrialized country a long time before that. And look how long it took us to get it together in 1956, and then to really kick off, by 1960 to really have. So it took us a while to recognize the value of SMEs. Your governments are beginning to do that. I have a lot of great examples of governments I think that are on the right track, particularly in being creative about access to financing. But I think really going back and having this push to have a structured SME Ministry of Small Business Administration, maybe in social enterprise or something like that, so that all these things could be marshaled. And so if you're on the list at your Ministry of SME, then your partner here, when they go and they can introduce themselves and want to see your database, this is a company that is respectable, they know what they're doing because they've made the list that's at your ministry. It gives you that extra qualification, that extra confidence to your potential partner to come in and work with you.
I think that's a fantastic point, the idea of a ministry of SMEs, if you will, whatever that scope might be, because we could share with you what Acrow does in its pursuit of local partners. Generally, we work very closely with the United States government, often referred to as USG. At the embassies are usually political econ officers or commercial service officers whose role is to facilitate U.S. business pursuits, interests, et cetera, within that market. They do many things from what they call gold key services to help companies not just connect with potential clients, but also with potential partners. And that involves a vetting process. Now, a lot of local SMEs are not aware of the fact that the United States government or these embassies are offering that service and actually seeking qualified partners that they could introduce to American business interests to facilitate economic business exchange. We utilize that extensively for a variety of reasons, including the issue that Ken raised, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In Africa and elsewhere, in economies that aren't necessarily fully diversified, the government still plays an outsized role in the economy. And in infrastructure in particular, local governments are almost exclusively managing that portfolio. So companies like Acrow, we're working with governments, which carries with it political risk, as well as risk under the FCPA. So it's important for us very early on in a project development process to make sure we're working with the right folks, that we understand the government's priorities with respect to certain projects, because we can't afford to have a mistake under the FCPA. In this country, it's rigorously enforced. And it's not just a slap on the wrist fine, executives go to prison. So we take that seriously. It's a core part of our mission, is making sure that the work that we do is appropriately integrated, consistent with the letter and spirit of the FCPA. But that's That can be challenging, especially on project development cycles that could be 5, 7, 8 years, which can be also a challenge for American SMEs when you're doing projects that take that long to develop. A lot of SMEs can't hang around that long. The larger blue chip companies, they have an army of folks posted around the world, consistent cash flow that's not episodic, so therefore they're able to wait out numerous administrations or waiting for that project to finally click. A lot of SMEs are run by folks who are not traditionally trained business executives. They're people who were good at their business, and now that they're expanding, they're moving into other markets. So when there is some level of opacity in the market, maybe not the result predictability or transparency that one would hope for, it's very hard for an SME in the United States to continue spending $15,000 to $20,000 a trip in a market without some idea that the PO or the contract is going to be either consummated or the project ultimately executed. So these are some of the challenges that American SMEs see. And I think that's a challenge for African SMEs because I honestly believe American SMEs will understand the challenges of African SMEs far more than, say, the large American corporates. So I do see a lot of potential being unlocked by having more of this integration between American SMEs and African SMEs, also because I believe that American companies are far more interested in local skills transfer than some of the projects we've seen sourced from other parts of the world.
I have a lot of follow-up questions to this, but I also see that our clock here, which you can't see, has turned to an alarming yellow, meaning it's time for us to open the floor and invite you to ask questions of our panelists and share your experiences. I don't know if we have a microphone that's going to go around, or if we have microphones in the room, but I would suggest that we maybe take 2 or 3 questions and then answer those. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I'm a supporter of the YALI program at the Presidential Precinct. A long time ago, I was a Fulbright scholar in India, so I use that as a frame of reference, but I'm from the Midwest and I live in Virginia now. I'd like to get a little elaboration on the free trade zone that is going to be set up in Africa. I've heard about it. You probably are more expert than anybody in the room, Ambassador, so could you elaborate a little bit on what will happen in 2018 and what the phase-in will be? Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you for your question. The CTM, which is commonly referred to as the Continental Trade Market, the African Union, which means the members of the African Union, have been trying to get the CTM off the ground for the last 8 years or so. They finally passed a resolution last year to have it up and running by early 2018. And I see the steps. I follow this very closely, so I see that they are moving in that direction. And the CTN would be a free trade market across the continent, bringing in, as I said, it's a $3.4 trillion potential market. And what I like about it, if they're able to do it, it's kind of, in a way, Paul and I sit on the United States Trade Representative Advisory Group for Africa. And so I like to think of the CTM as kind of the reverse AGOA in a way, where you have, an AGOA for your entire continent, where goods and services and tariffs and movement would be a lot easier. You have some of that regionally, like in ECOWAS and some other places, but this would give you, as a business person, access to the entire potential market that's out there. And the other thing I want to add to that a little bit, particularly because of the trade aspect, is that you have an opportunity as SMEs, and I say, the diaspora, that means everybody that falls in that aspect, as well as people who are not part of the diaspora. But to be creative about how you build that financing element that he talked about. What I really have loved to see, and I do talk a little bit about it in the book, is this new way of valuing how companies can capitalize. And so you have one I think it's in Rwanda, called Comptable. And they look at your social media presence. They look at, other things besides what you have in the bank to value your potential and who your market might be. You have a PayPal-like entity as well that looks at how much movement of resources you do back and forth and take that as a loan that you can borrow on for that same amount. So there's some creative things that are being done, so when that CTM kicks off, you have the opportunity to have the entire market available to you. I had one young woman this morning from Burkina Faso say to me, you know, the women that I'm training, you know, don't have access to market. And then I said to her, do you have internet? She said, yes. And I said, well, if you have an internet, you have a market.
I think it's a very interesting question, so let me bring in the other two panelists as well. I met recently in Dakar with a regional representative of the IFC who's responsible for 5 countries in the region, Senegal, Mauritania, and 3 others. And she was joking, she was Pakistani, she was joking that the 5 countries she's responsible for, the population is smaller than the population of the city she was born in Pakistan. So the fragmentation of the African market that still exists, is that something that you experience? Is that something that limits you, that you have to deal with different sets of actors, different sets of laws in each of those countries where you build a bridge or a power grid?
I mean, we deal in the energy sector. So if you look at the U.S. grid, it's a patchwork. And so from local municipalities to co-ops to big utilities. So we are constantly dealing with that. So it's kind of this, for us, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, with respect to different population variances among countries, it just changes your approach. You know, certain countries have a profile to embark upon a large finance project, and perhaps others do not. So your approach would change. I think, for instance, in a country that does have access to the international capital markets, you can develop these large finance comprehensive bridge development programs. I think in smaller countries, perhaps you're working more closely with the SME contractors and engineering firms. So you're adjusting your model to the circumstances on the ground.
I see there's another question back there. Oh, sorry, table 2.
Yes, thank you to the panel. I have a question. You mentioned capacity building for local partners, and you mentioned training. I was wondering, because there have been this push for manufacturing on the African continent. So what are you doing to ensure that there's more manufacturing in terms of capacity building on the continent? And how does corruption hinder or facilitate the work you're doing on the ground, but also instability in certain countries where you are operating? You mentioned Cameroon, and we have seen what is happening. So what is the impact of conflict on the work that you are doing on the continent? Thank you.
Well, with regard to the corruption issue, obviously our approach is to indicate very early on how we do business. And usually, as I said earlier, we work very closely with the United States government. So I think it's quite clear when we start developing the project and building our proposal that there is a certain way that this project will be assembled. Also, we're working with major international partners, whether it be a major international financial institution, a bank, or Export-Import Bank of the United States, or OPIC, which is a DFI. And there's a sense in the room when those folks are participants that there's not going to be any kind of, you know, untoward payments, et cetera, that would run afoul of the FCPA. Now, with respect to manufacturing, you raise an excellent point. Part of economic diversification is building an industrial base, and you hear that more and more in different countries. I think one of the challenges to developing an industrial base is the lack of power. And President Obama's Power Africa initiative was designed to address that issue. You know, at the end of the day, manufacturing, particularly heavy industry like what we do, where you have steel fabrication, requires a lot of energy, and you need adequate infrastructure for logistics, et cetera, to move product around. And I think policies have been developed and are continuing to accelerate in different countries across Africa that are helping countries industrialize more. I think certainly we're seeing a lot of activity in Ethiopia on that front, and many other countries that I won't name because I don't want to leave other countries off that list. You know, right now, I think you have to look as a business to your value proposition. I think right now when we're talking with policymakers, they're asking for American technology for infrastructure. So that's what we offer. Now, could we manufacture on the African continent? Sure. The challenge there is you have to choose the right country that has all of the things that we talked about, power, infrastructure, et cetera. And then you have to think about, is that helping you build a persuasive case that develops your business? At the end of the day, what Ken said is, this is trade and investment and business. This is not aid. So I don't know if it matters to Botswana that we're manufacturing in Togo. Is that a value proposition that makes sense? So again, at the end of the day, it's a business decision. And with some of the infrastructure and power challenges, and also making the broader regional case that you are manufacturing in one country and therefore that might provide you a competitive advantage in another country, we're not seeing that be the case yet. I'm not convinced that someone in Kenya is willing to buy a bridge more so today if we're manufacturing it in South Africa than if we're manufacturing it in the United States. And in fact, oftentimes what we're hearing is we want an American manufactured infrastructure product because we know what comes with that is a lot of skills transfer and training, et cetera. And as I mentioned before, and I probably didn't share the numbers, but we've trained thousands of African engineers and technicians in the assembly and installation of these bridges. And we do look forward to the opportunity in the years ahead to find the right conditions for manufacturing on the continent.
Please, yeah.
I didn't complete the other question, but it really tags onto this. Go back to those special economic zones or industrial clusters or competitive clusters that I mentioned earlier. There are about 9 or so being built on the continent today, mostly by China. And what they are doing is that's where your manufacturing and your training and your dedicated power. They have, dedicated power coming in to address the power issue. They've got the training element for SMEs to be part of that. They've got this is the design, we'll have to see how this plays out. And the design then is to have larger companies come in as well so that you build a manufacturing special economic zone. And you have your large companies there and your SMEs there. And there are great examples around the world. The one that I'll use today is in France, actually. They have competitive clusters, and they bring in SMEs, and it's got a training component, dedicated power, all resources are there that an SME would need. They bring in their big businesses, so they're able to partner. We talked about making those linkages. And that's where the idea to marry together to do the manufacturing and the training that you talked about can happen. So I really like that model that I see happening, and because I think it gives you a leg up, because all of the challenges that might be there on the infrastructure side are taken away. You won't have them there.
I think we'll have an opportunity to speak after this panel as well. So let me maybe finish and wrap things up with one last question to all of you. Like I said, I've met a lot of Yali fellows who start their own companies, who are entrepreneurs, launch their startups. If you could give them one piece of advice, preferably in about 30 seconds each, what would that be? How do you succeed in the African SME world today?
30 seconds. Work on your passion, whatever it is. You gotta. It's 24 hours a day. You gotta love what you do. So work on your passion. Take your passion and convert that into an SME. Find a niche that's empty that you can step into, whether it's the first vegetarian restaurant in Cape Town or whatever it might be. But work on your passion and understand what your markets are, and use the internet, the knowledge management, and the mobility that I talked about earlier to do whatever you want to do to fill that passion, and to also look at those niche services that aren't there in your country that you can step in and do. Just takes the first step.
I would offer 2 quick ones, 30 seconds or less. The first one is hone your value proposition. You should always be able to fall out of bed at 3 in the morning and deliver in 10 seconds who you are, what you do, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. And the last thing I would say is subscribe to the zigzag theory of personal growth. Success in life is rarely a straight line, and I think what you should be doing to follow up on the Honorable Ambassador's suggestion is follow your passion to the point where it pushes you into a corner and you have to think yourself out of the corner, and sometimes you'll find yourself taking on opportunities that you never even imagined when you first started that journey. So don't be afraid of failure. I know people say that, particularly in Silicon Valley, that seems to be a badge of honor, but there is some validity to that, and just keep yourself open to opportunity. You never know when that moment happens, perhaps at 3 in the morning when you're falling out of bed.
Great. All I would say is, a reputation takes a long time to build, but it's easily broken. At the end of the day, that's all you really have. And so as you're looking for partners, if your reputation is great, you'll find partners to work with.
I think these were all great 30-second pieces of advice. We're going to go back to our tables, and we hope that we'll continue the conversation with you there. But in the meantime, let's please join me in giving a round of thanks and applause, everyone.